Franklin Hale had learned, long before the world began calling him powerful, that the truest test of a person was never found in moments of applause or achievement, but in the quiet spaces where no one expected decency. And that belief guided him on a gray Tuesday afternoon when rain pressed softly against the city and routine dulled the sharp edges of ambition as he parked his old sedan, not the fleet of luxury vehicles registered under his name, but the same reliable car he'd driven for years, across the street from one of Greenwood Motors' most profitable luxury dealerships, a place built of glass, chrome, and carefully rehearsed smiles. And before stepping out, he sat for a moment with his hands resting on the steering wheel, watching reflections of himself in the rain-slicked windshield, not as a billionaire CEO, but as a man shaped by memory, remembering his father's voice, low and steady, telling him decades earlier that success was not about being seen, but about seeing others. And when Franklin finally stepped inside the showroom, dressed in simple clothes that blended more with invisibility than authority, the atmosphere responded instantly, though no alarm rang and no sign flashed, because judgment rarely announces itself. It simply settles in, quiet and confident, the way conversations dipped a half octave as heads turned, eyes scanning him not with curiosity but with calculation. The manager pausing mid-laugh to take him in from worn shoes to unbranded jacket, his smile tightening into something practiced and dismissive, as if Franklin had already failed an unspoken audition. And within seconds, the unkind choreography began. Sales associates redirecting themselves toward shinier prospects, customers allowing their glances to linger just long enough to communicate exclusion. And then the manager's voice cut through the air with a tone that was half amusement, half warning. "Sir, just so you know, our vehicles start at a level that surprises most people." And the words landed exactly where they were intended, sparking muted laughter from nearby staff and giving strangers permission to feel superior. And Franklin felt it then. Not embarrassment, but recognition, the echo of 100 moments from childhood when he'd stood beside his father in places just like this, watching the same expressions form on the same kinds of faces. His father's hands rough and stained with oil, his posture calm despite the insults. And Franklin remembered asking once why his father never got angry, why he never shouted back. And his father had smiled gently and said, "Because anger is loud, son, but dignity lasts longer." And now here, Franklin stood decades later holding that same silence, observing rather than reacting, because today was not about defending himself, it was about witnessing truth. And as the manager turned away from him, effectively dismissing his presence, Franklin noticed how quickly invisibility settled in, how easily a room could decide someone didn't matter, until a subtle shift occurred, almost imperceptible at first, when a young woman near the back of the showroom paused, watching him with an expression that didn't match the others, her name tag reading Emma, her posture uncertain but attentive, and she hesitated only a second before stepping forward, her voice soft yet sincere as she said, "Sir, you're welcome to look around. Please don't feel rushed, and if you need any help, I'm here." And something about her tone disrupted the rhythm of the room, because kindness without motive always does, and the manager's head snapped up instantly, his eyes sharp as he barked her name in a warning laced with irritation, muttering that she shouldn't waste time or embarrass the team, that some people were just browsing, that commissions mattered. And Franklin watched Emma closely, saw the flicker of fear cross her face, the calculation of consequences, the weight of being new, being replaceable, being alone. And yet she didn't step back, didn't apologize, didn't redirect her attention. She simply stood, hands clasped, eyes steady, offering respect without conditions. And in that moment, Franklin felt something shift inside him, because power reveals itself most clearly when someone chooses to do the right thing, even when it costs them safety. And after thanking her quietly, he turned and walked toward the exit, leaving behind confusion, laughter that felt suddenly thinner, and a room that resumed its noise too quickly, as if silence might expose guilt. And outside, under the soft insistence of rain, Franklin paused just long enough to fold a small note and slip it into Emma's hand as he passed her, his fingers brushing hers for only a second. And she didn't open it right away because the weight of the encounter followed her long after he left, through the rest of her shift where coworkers avoided her, through the manager's cold glances, through the walk home where the city felt louder than usual. And that night, lying awake with the note unopened on her bedside table, Emma replayed the scene again and again, wondering if kindness had just cost her more than she could afford, unaware that somewhere across the city, Franklin sat alone in his office looking out over the skyline, thinking not about profits or reports, but about a young woman who had reminded him why his father's legacy mattered, and why tomorrow would change everything. The night after Franklin left the dealership, the rain finally stopped, but Emma's thoughts did not, and she lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, listening to the hum of distant traffic and the occasional drip from a leaky faucet, her fingers brushing the folded note on her bedside table without opening it, because part of her feared that whatever was written inside might confirm the worst, that she had crossed an invisible line and tomorrow would bring consequences disguised as professionalism. And as the hours crept by, she replayed the manager's expression again and again, the way his jaw tightened when she spoke, the way her coworkers' laughter had quieted when Franklin thanked her, the way isolation settles faster than shame. And she wondered when the world had taught people that respect was something to be rationed, remembering her mother working double shifts at a diner, teaching her that dignity cost nothing and paid everything, while across the city, Franklin sat in his office long after the lights of other floors had gone dark, reviewing reports he'd read 100 times before, his thoughts drifting instead to his father's hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug late at night. The way his father used to tell stories not about success, but about moments, being given a chance, being treated fairly, being seen. And Franklin thought about how many systems quietly trained people to unlearn empathy, how companies praised values on walls while rewarding behavior that contradicted them. And he wondered how many Emmas existed in his organization, and how many had already been silenced. And when morning arrived, it did so without ceremony, sunlight slipping through Emma's blinds as her alarm buzzed too early, her stomach tight as she finally unfolded the note and read the address in time, her heart racing as questions piled up faster than answers, debating whether to ignore it, whether it was safer not to go, whether courage was something she could afford twice. And yet when she stood in front of Greenwood Tower hours later, dwarfed by glass and steel rising into the clouds, her legs shaking as she nearly turned back twice, something steadier than fear pushed her forward. And inside the building, everything felt different. Quiet, efficient, purposeful, as if respect lived in the walls, and the receptionist greeted her by name without surprise, without judgment, offering a smile that felt practiced but genuine. And as the elevator climbed floor after floor, Emma felt each second stretch, her reflection in the mirrored walls looking smaller the higher she went, until the doors opened onto a floor so quiet it felt sacred, sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows, and there he stood, Franklin, no longer blending into the background, but unmistakably present in a tailored suit that fit him like confidence earned slowly, not loudly. And for a moment, Emma wondered if she was in the wrong place, if she had misunderstood everything, until he smiled, the same gentle smile from the dealership, and said her name like it mattered. And she felt the air leave her lungs as realization settled, and Franklin invited her to sit not across a desk, but beside a window overlooking the city, explaining calmly that Greenwood Motors wasn't just a company, but a promise passed down from his father, a man who had been dismissed more times than he could count, and that yesterday's visit had not been a test designed to trap anyone, but a question he had been afraid to ask, whether the company still remembered who it was supposed to serve. And as Emma listened, hands clasped tightly in her lap, Franklin described watching the dealership from the corner of his eye, seeing how quickly cruelty organized itself, how easily people learned who it was acceptable to disrespect. And when he told her that her choice to step forward had answered his question more clearly than any survey or audit ever could, tears welled in her eyes, not from pride, but from release, because she hadn't realized how heavy it had felt to carry that moment alone. And when Franklin slid an envelope across the table and explained the position he was offering, not as a reward but as a responsibility, Emma's first instinct was disbelief, followed closely by fear, because opportunity often feels heavier than loss. And as she asked whether the manager knew whether she was in trouble, Franklin shook his head gently and said something that would echo in her mind for years, that authority without humanity is not leadership, but noise, and that companies do not rot overnight, but erode quietly when small acts of cruelty go unchallenged. And as Emma left the tower hours later with a badge she hadn't expected in a future she hadn't planned for, the city felt different beneath her feet, not brighter, but sharper, because growth always demands clarity. And back at the dealership, the atmosphere shifted before she even spoke, rumors traveling faster than truth as the manager was called into a private meeting and returned pale and silent. And coworkers who had avoided her the day before now watched carefully, uncertain how kindness had suddenly become power. While Emma moved through the showroom with a new weight in her steps, not arrogance, but awareness, knowing that the hardest part of courage is not standing up once, but continuing to stand when the room finally notices. And far above them, Franklin watched from his office window as the city moved endlessly below, thinking not about the deal he'd closed or the headlines he'd avoided, but about the fragile moment when someone chooses to see another person, knowing that what began as a quiet walk into a showroom was now unfolding into something far larger than either of them had imagined. The days that followed Emma's quiet return to the dealership did not explode with drama the way movies suggested they might, but instead unfolded with a subtler, more unsettling tension, the kind that seeps into hallways and conversations, where smiles linger a second too long and silence carries more weight than words. And Emma felt it immediately as she walked the showroom floor, now wearing a badge that didn't make her powerful so much as visible. Because authority, she quickly learned, changes how people look at you long before it changes how they listen. And while some coworkers greeted her with cautious politeness, others avoided her entirely, unsure whether she was still one of them or something else now. And the manager, once so confident in his dismissiveness, moved like a man who had suddenly realized the ground beneath him was not as solid as he believed, speaking carefully, watching his tone, measuring his words, because power had quietly shifted without announcement. And Emma struggled with the weight of it all, because she had never wanted influence, only fairness. And now she found herself in meetings she never imagined attending, listening as patterns she had sensed but never named were laid out plainly, customer complaints dismissed, employees pressured to prioritize commissions over care, a culture slowly trained to reward indifference. And as Franklin listened beside her, saying little, Emma realized leadership was not about having answers, but about having the courage to face uncomfortable truths without flinching. And while some executives nodded thoughtfully, others resisted, insisting the numbers were strong, profits steady, reputation intact. And Franklin responded not with anger, but with stories, recounting moments like the one Emma had lived, reminding them that trust erodes long before revenue does, and that companies don't collapse from scandal alone, but from the quiet accumulation of ignored harm. And back on the showroom floor, customers began to notice small changes, not slogans, not posters, but behavior. Salespeople taking time, listening more, apologizing when mistakes were made, because Emma insisted on one rule above all others, that respect was not conditional on wealth, and that rule unsettled those who had grown comfortable measuring worth by appearance. And resistance came in whispers and complaints, anonymous emails questioning Emma's qualifications, subtle attempts to undermine her authority, because systems push back when they are challenged, and Emma felt the strain of it late at night, sitting alone in her apartment staring at walls that now felt too quiet, wondering if she was strong enough to carry responsibility she never sought. While Franklin, watching the changes ripple outward across multiple locations, felt both pride and unease, knowing transformation always invites conflict. And he remembered his father telling him once that doing the right thing doesn't make life easier, it makes it honest. And honesty costs. And the cost arrived one afternoon when a high-performing but notoriously arrogant salesperson openly defied Emma in front of staff, dismissing her guidance as soft, claiming kindness didn't close deals. And the room froze, eyes darting between them, waiting to see whether authority would finally assert itself loudly or retreat quietly. And Emma felt fear rise, but also clarity. And she responded not with punishment, but with truth, calmly pointing out that the same salesperson had the highest number of complaints alongside his sales, that success without integrity was not success Greenwood Motors would defend. And when Franklin later upheld her decision to terminate the employee despite pushback from the board, a message traveled faster than any memo ever could, that this change was real, irreversible, and rooted in values, not image. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the culture began to shift, not because people were forced to comply, but because expectations had changed, and new hires were trained differently, stories shared openly, mistakes discussed instead of hidden. And Emma watched employees who once mocked empathy begin to practice it, not perfectly, but genuinely. And one evening, as she locked up the showroom after a long day, she noticed a man standing uncertainly by the door, older, tired, dressed plainly, and without hesitation she walked over, welcomed him in, offered him water, listened to his story, unaware that somewhere in the building a camera captured the moment, not for surveillance but for reflection, because Franklin had instructed that such moments be saved, not to shame but to remember. And later that night he watched the footage alone, not smiling but nodding slowly, because this quiet consistency was what legacy actually looked like. And as months passed and word spread, Greenwood Motors became known not just for luxury vehicles, but for humanity, attracting customers who stayed loyal and employees who felt pride. And Emma, once invisible, now found herself mentoring others, reminding them gently that courage doesn't always feel heroic, that most days it feels like doubt, fatigue, and choosing kindness anyway. And though challenges remained because no system is ever fully healed, the direction was set. And one afternoon, as Emma and Franklin stood looking out over the city from the same window where her life had first shifted, Franklin said something simple that anchored everything that followed, that the world does not change through grand gestures alone, but through ordinary people refusing to become unkind in environments that reward it. And Emma understood then that the moment she stepped forward in that showroom had never truly ended. It had simply expanded, unfolding into a life defined not by titles, but by the courage to keep seeing people as people, even when it would be easier not to. As the months passed, Emma's life and Greenwood Motors itself began to feel almost unrecognizable compared to the quiet days before Franklin's subtle test. And every decision she made, every small act of attentiveness seemed to reverberate outward, touching people she had never met, affecting outcomes she could not see as she walked the showroom floor and greeted customers with genuine warmth, asking questions not to sell but to understand, listening to their stories, their struggles, their fears. And slowly, employees began to mimic her example. Not because she demanded it, but because consistency breeds credibility, and the company itself shifted in ways that could not be measured on spreadsheets alone, as the culture of fear and indifference that had quietly governed the staff for decades was replaced by one where accountability and empathy became core operating principles. And yet, the shift was never without challenge, as those who had grown comfortable with shortcuts and cynicism pushed back, quietly at first, in the form of gossip, minor insubordination, and pointedly missed deadlines, and sometimes openly, like the day a long-tenured manager called her into his office to argue that her insistence on empathy over sales would ruin profits. And Emma listened, heart pounding, hands trembling slightly as she recounted not only the numbers he claimed she was threatening, but the hundreds of small moments where respect and dignity had prevented larger, costlier mistakes. And Franklin, observing the confrontation from his office via the new mentorship program cameras he had insisted on, later reassured her that courage was rarely comfortable and that the ability to remain calm and principled under pressure was the true test of leadership. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, patterns began to change, as the very acts that had been questioned, ridiculed, or dismissed became benchmarks for new employees who saw that kindness was not weakness, but a cornerstone of lasting influence. And word of Greenwood's evolving culture spread beyond its walls, reaching customers who valued trust and transparency, competitors who watched in disbelief as a company once known solely for luxury vehicles now became known known for integrity. And even media outlets began to take note, telling stories not about quarterly profits, but about how a young woman's quiet courage had catalyzed change in an empire. And Emma herself grew in ways she had never anticipated, learning that leadership is not about being liked or being right in every moment, but about doing what is right consistently, even when no one notices, and sometimes even when the consequences are personal, because one afternoon she discovered a former friend from college had been quietly spreading rumors that she had only attained her position through favoritism. And Emma realized that doing the right thing often isolates you before it connects you, and she allowed herself to feel the sting but did not respond in kind, choosing instead to continue mentoring, listening, and reinforcing the values she now embodied. And Franklin, observing her growth from his office high above the city, reflected on his own journey, remembering the countless times his father had been overlooked, laughed at, and underestimated, and realizing that what he had set in motion with a single quiet test had not only honored his father's legacy, but had revealed the latent potential for integrity in someone who might have otherwise been dismissed. And as Greenwood Motors expanded under this renewed culture, they introduced initiatives that supported employees' families, community engagement programs, and customer-first policies that required more than compliance. They required empathy, accountability, and courage. And Emma found herself at the center of this transformation, coaching, guiding, correcting, and celebrating victories both big and small. And each day, the memory of that rainy showroom where she first chose to act with kindness echoed in her mind, reminding her that courage is rarely a singular act, but a series of small decisions repeated until they define character. And as the years unfolded, Emma's story began to inspire not only her colleagues, but the next generation of employees who were taught from the start that respect cannot be simulated, that decency is not optional, and that every interaction, no matter how small, matters far more than the metrics by which companies traditionally measure success. And sometimes, late at night, Emma would stand by the same corner of the showroom where she had first spoken to Franklin, watching the reflections of customers in the polished floors, feeling the weight and the joy of responsibility, and realizing that while no act of courage guarantees immediate reward, it invariably shapes the future in ways invisible to the eye but undeniable to the heart. And somewhere above her in Greenwood Tower, Franklin would observe the same scene, remembering the small details of her posture, her gaze, her quiet defiance against discouragement, and understanding that true influence grows quietly, patiently, and persistently, like roots spreading beneath soil, unseen but holding everything upright. And as this pattern repeated itself across offices, dealerships, and cities, the story of a man dressed simply and a young woman who chose courage over conformity rippled outward, transforming not just a company, but an ecosystem of human interaction, proving to everyone involved, employees, customers, and competitors alike, that empathy is contagious, integrity is profitable in ways beyond money, and that a single act of kindness, when amplified through consistency, can shift an entire culture. And Emma, reflecting on her journey, recognized that the hardest victories are invisible. The victories that matter most are those where no one applauds, and that the life-changing moment is often the one the world overlooks. Yet, from these quiet choices emerges a legacy. And the city beneath Greenwood Tower continued to move, unaware of the moral architecture being built within its walls, while Franklin and Emma, bound by that single choice in a rainy showroom, knew that this was the true measure of success. Not the cars, not the deals, not the public accolades, but the enduring effect of integrity, courage, and kindness on people, culture, and time itself. Years passed, and Greenwood Motors became more than a company. It became a living testament to what happens when courage, kindness, and integrity are chosen repeatedly, quietly, in moments no one thinks matter. And Emma, once a young saleswoman hesitant to speak, now moved through offices, dealerships, and boardrooms with a quiet authority born not from ego, but from the understanding that influence is measured in how people feel seen and valued. And every decision she made, from hiring to customer care to employee development, carried the weight of that rainy afternoon when she had first noticed a man who seemed remained invisible and chosen to act with empathy despite the judgment around her. And those choices rippled outward across every department, changing culture, altering priorities, and inspiring colleagues to reconsider their own behavior as Franklin watched from Greenwood Tower, reflecting on the hundreds of small moments that had grown into an unshakable moral architecture, remembering his father's hands, the worn coffee mugs, the stories of small victories over apathy and cruelty, and understanding that the world he had inherited was being reshaped not by wealth or authority, but by the quiet courage of someone willing to do right when doing so was inconvenient, uncomfortable, and unseen. And in this time, the company began implementing initiatives beyond business, community programs supporting families, mentorship programs for young employees, customer advocacy groups, and policies that codified empathy as an operational value. And Emma, sometimes overwhelmed, sometimes doubting her ability to carry the weight of responsibility, discovered that courage is not a singular event, but a series of choices repeated every day in every interaction, knowing that the moments where no one is watching are the ones that shape the future most profoundly. And she would often pause by the showroom window, watching reflections of customers, employees, and even strangers in the glass, and remember the note, the quiet smile, the test that Franklin had set in motion, realizing that legacy is born in those small decisions that ripple outward silently until they become unstoppable. And Franklin, observing the same scene from his office, felt both pride and humility, because he had never orchestrated a story for accolades, only sought to see whether goodness still existed in the people around him. And watching Emma now, leading with courage and compassion, he knew the answer, and it was far beyond any ledger or metric. For Greenwood Motors' real success was invisible yet undeniable, existing in culture and human connection, in respect and dignity. And as the city moved endlessly beneath Greenwood Tower, the story of a man dressed simply in a showroom, a young woman who chose courage over fear, and the quiet ripples of kindness and integrity they set in motion reached far beyond those walls, touching employees, customers, communities, and even competitors who began to wonder whether they had measured success incorrectly all along. And Emma, standing at the same corner where she had first spoken to Franklin, finally understood the deepest truth, that life is a series of choices, and the choices we make when no one is watching define who we are, who we protect, what we build, and how far one act of courage can truly carry. And as she looked out across the city, badge gleaming in the sunlight, she whispered a silent promise to never stop choosing kindness, knowing that it would not always be recognized, sometimes not rewarded, sometimes lonely, but that every ripple she created had the power to transform lives, shape culture, and leave a legacy far greater than any individual. And Franklin, watching quietly from the top floor, smiled to himself, because he knew that this, the quiet resilience, the invisible impact, the enduring courage, was the real story, the story that would last long after titles, money, and fame faded, proving, finally, that true greatness is measured not by what we take, but by what we give, not by how we are seen, but by how we see others. And as Emma and Franklin stood silently in their respective spaces, connected across distance and experience, the city beneath them continued to move, unaware of the moral foundation being laid above it, and yet the lessons would ripple outward infinitely, echoing the truth that courage, kindness, and integrity are forces capable of shaping futures, redefining success, and transforming the world, one quiet choice at a time. And in that understanding, the story ends not with applause, but with the profound satisfaction of knowing that goodness, when nurtured and multiplied, never truly fails, and that the first moment of courage, the one small act Emma had chosen in a rainy showroom long ago, had quietly become the seed of a legacy that would continue to grow, unseen, unstoppable, and everlasting.